Hi, Misha here, and with the new camera and the mic, and just because, frankly, I felt like it, let's talk again about the MiG-21, the Balalaika, the FISHBED, what have you, of, well, Vietnam fame amongst many, many others. And I have 6 1/72 scale die-cast models. These are actually all from Hobby Master. Unfortunately, they don't make the entire MiG-21 series with every single variant, especially the early ones. But we'll make do and kind of talk about the differences, because it is kind of confusing, the naming conventions. There were well over 20 different variants of this aircraft. More if you kind of get into sub-variants, and then some customized for export versions. And it's actually the most mass-produced supersonic jet in history, and for a long time it had the longest production run, ranging from 1958 all the way up through 1984, but that's been surpassed by the F-16 these days. But it's still a very iconic piece of both MiG and Soviet design. So, on the far left we have a relatively early one. This is a PFM variant for the PVO, the Anti-Aircraft or Air Self-Defense Force of Russia. We'll also talk about the early 21F and 21F-13s. And then we have kind of a late first generation or early second, depending on who you talk to. This is a 21R reconnaissance, although it was a tactical reconnaissance, so it was armed. And then we'll move into what are firmly second generation. We'll have the 21MF and the 21 SMT and the very similar 21 MT. These are kind of where they were transitioning from one generation to another. And then the final generation, some call it 3, some call it 4, we have the 21 BIS, BIS, which basically means 21 plus. And of course these will have different names: FISHBED, A, B, C, D, all the way through J and so on. So with that, yeah, we'll just kind of dive on in and talk about some MiGs. Probably going to focus mostly on telling the variants apart in this video, because yeah, this is kind of a thing. And if we did a full MiG history video, it'd be about 4.5 hours edited. The earliest model I have here is the MiG-21 PFM, known in the West, known by NATO as the FISHBED F. And you can tell by the name, this is kind of a late first generation. So let's go back. The MiG-21 is a result of the Korean War. And in the West, and well, America, the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter was built to be a lightweight, high-speed, kind of meant for appealing to pilots. Well, this is kind of the Russian take on it. They had much the same feedback. Around 1953, the Russian government put out kind of a general order, a broad request for a new aircraft. It needed to be Mach 2 capable. It needed to have a radar-guided gun sight, be armed with a cannon, and be lightweight, daytime, a fighter interceptor for use by the VVS and the PVO. And in 1954, the MiG Bureau, or really MiG's Design Bureau, was given the go-ahead to work on it. The other firms had put forward proposals, but MiG's star was very high after the 15, the 17, and the 19 was coming online a short time later. And they would start off with several concepts known as the YE, running all the way really through YE1 through YE5. And they wanted to use a new R11 engine, but for the first few prototypes they had to use the R9 because the R11 was having production. Anyway, didn't matter difficulties. So the earliest test flights of the YE2 and later YE5 were a little underwhelming because of the engine. Now they weren't sure what they were going to do. They thought about doing a swept-back wing or doing a delta wing. And as you can tell by the MiG-21, they ended up going with the delta wing. The YE5 would kind of get the go-ahead in 1956, becoming the MiG-21. It would evolve into the YE6, and then finally, which was a kind of a pre-production series in 1957, which would be finalized as the YE6T. And this would be the first to be adopted as the MiG-21F. And NATO didn't know what was really going on in 1956, 1957. In fact, they mixed this up with a Sukhoi Su-9, the fish pot, and names got a little weird. By the way, the swept wing version was loosely designated MiG-23, but since it never went into production, that name was kind of recycled. So in 1958, they were getting into some pre-production models and ramping up for full production, and it would enter into service in 1959. Now, the original 21F, well, it was armed with two 30 caliber cannon. It had a gun sight. It was a daytime fighter. The cannon were its main armament, kind of taking after the MiG-15 and MiG-17. It could carry a bomb or a rocket pack on each wing, and with the 21F it could carry a relatively small fuel tank under the belly, so it had a total of 3 hard points, 3 attachment points for ordnance. It was light and nimble, very simple, and yeah, did a lot. Now, interestingly, the 21F would not be around for long. Already by 1960, it was replaced in production and soon in service by the 21F-13. Now, the requirement for air-to-air missiles was added to the design, but Russia was kind of not that interested for some time. It really wasn't until 1958 when they got their hands on AIM-9B Sidewinders, thanks to the whole incident in Taiwan, that they quickly reverse engineered it as the K5 and K13 series of missiles, sometimes called R5 or R13, and known in the West as the AA-2 Atoll. So basically, yeah, a copy of the early AIM-9 Sidewinder. And so with the F-13, which was the first one to really be produced in numbers, they made fewer than 100 of the F. They would have 2 missiles, one under each wing. They would also have to remove one of the 30mm cannon, retaining the other. And they would also allow it to use a larger underbelly fuel tank, because this was a short-range point defense interceptor or fighter. It was not meant for long flights, and it didn't have a terribly heavy payload, especially early on. It also had a kind of odd ejection seat system where the canopy opened forward. But that was for the VVS, the Russian Air Force. The PVO, the Russian kind of air self-defense force or anti-aircraft force, also wanted a version of the aircraft. And that's where this one kind of comes into play. Let's take this guy off the stand. Now, the FISHBED A was the pre-production model. The FISHBED B for NATO was actually the 21F, and the FISHBED C was the 21F-13, the first to have air-to-air missiles. But these were still day fighters, and they really didn't have a radar to speak of. The 21P, or FISHBED D, was the first to have a Sapphire radar, and it was for the PVO. It was meant to be an all-weather, so day or nighttime fighter, and it was first put into production in 1960. Now, the 21P had the same 2 missiles under the wings. It could carry a fuel tank under the fuselage, but it was really meant to be controlled from the ground, and so the radar was pretty short range. Also, because of the nose cone system, there wasn't a lot of room for radar, and electronics of this era were quite bulky. But regardless, the 21P was the first version for that force, and it was also the first that deleted the 30mm cannon. But not many of the 21Ps were produced. It quickly gave way to the 21PF, or the FISHBED E. Now, this version had an uprated engine, and it was basically just tweaked. It had a larger tank, and hobos now meowing. So really the 21PF was the first capable version and the first to see real use. But then that would give way quite quickly to the 21PFS, which had blown flaps, which had some benefits. And the 21PFS was introduced as in 1964, and NATO knew it as the FISHBED F. It was actually quickly replaced even that year by the 21PFM, the version here. We're finally here. Yay! The 21PFM had an improved afterburner. It had a larger tailplane. This is an all-moving tail. It has this kind of spine, which gives more room for avionics and also fuel tankage. It had an improved SAP-4 radar with slightly better range, and it also had the ability to mount a new gun pod. They wanted to get back to having cannon. This is a 23mm cannon, and it's a weird system that's actually quite good. It's called a teeter-totter, where one barrel will fire and then bounce back, pushing the other barrel forward. It'll fire, bounce back, so back and forth. And they had 200 rounds in there. So to go along with that, they had an improved gun sight, and of course they had improved radar. And by this point, the Atoll missile was also being improved, and so it was kind of the version. Now the F-13 was exported from Russia, and this was the first Interceptor version to really be exported. The previous ones really weren't. Yeah, so the F and F-13 were fighters, day fighters. This was an all-weather point defense interceptor, and quite successful. Now, one thing is the ejection seat. Early on, the PFM had the same as before, but they would go away from the front hinged single piece to a side hinged two-piece when they went to a new KM1 ejection seat, replacing the older SK. The benefit, this was a zero altitude, but not zero speed. You had to be at least 75, 80 miles per hour to be safe, but it was a vast improvement on safety from the previous ones. And they didn't actually change the name. This was still the PFM. It was just an incremental change. In fact, the PFS and PFMs were all known to NATO as the FISHBED F. And by 1964-65, we're starting to really standardize and develop this into something quite effective, quite very good. And that's where this kind of modern version. Another thing, the pitot tube would move around. On early versions, it was at the bottom and would actually hinge up when it was on the ground to kind of be out of the way and for storage, and so you wouldn't whack your head. I've actually whacked my head on a pitot tube. It is it's as uncomfortable as you imagine. So they moved it up to kind of keep it out of the way. This also gave more room for the improved radar and the intake cone. Originally, the cones were manually adjusted, but very soon they would go to basically automatics, and the blown flap system would basically become standardized on this version here. And they would produce these for quite a large time. But that was kind of where the first generation of the MiG-21 would end. This is probably my favorite model, actually. It's just cool. I love the little gun pod. Like all Hobby Masters, the pilot's removable, and like I said, these were controlled from the ground because they were defense fighters more than anything else. But with that, let's get in to Generation 2. Before we move on, I wanted to show you the export version of the MiG-21 PFM, flown by Czechoslovakia, Poland, and others. The only noticeable difference externally is that instead of having the 23mm gun pod as on Russian models, it has the same centerline fuel tank as used on the original PF and PFS. Makes sense, it still gives it the range. The wings were not plumbed for tanks. Anyway, you wouldn't want to put tanks on the wings because then you would have no weapons. With only 2 missiles, this was still a short range, short endurance point interceptor. And 2 might seem very small, but to keep in mind the British English Electric Lightning only had 2 originally too. It was a different time in the early and mid 60s. Be another model from Hobby Master here. So I just thought I would show you briefly before we move on. Centerline tank is cool. Somewhat interesting, the second generation of MiG-21s began with a tactical reconnaissance variant, the 21R, known in the West as the FISHBED H. Now, there were 2-seat trainers. I'm not covering them in this video just because, well, time, and also I don't have models of them yet. Maybe one day someone will make one. Anyway, FISHBED H. This was for the VVS. There was obviously a reconnaissance variant. It was kind of taking the developments from the PFM, including the ejection seat and the radar and the newer engines, the blown flaps, and continuing on. The spine that was already started off is now getting larger again. Notice it's kind of got an hourglass shape. It tapers in the back but then bulges up here. This allows for more fuel and avionics. Has the 2-piece canopy. Now the nose has the now kind of iconic offset pitot tube. This is actually to give room for this system here, which is an angle of attack indicator, something that previous 21s lacked. You can see the elements on it, and the engine there, and the weather vane in the top. So that required the new pitot tube. And on the center line bottom now, instead of using a fuel tank, we have camera pods. And there were several options used over the years. This particular Hobby Master is actually from the Polish Air Force. They had daylight pods, nighttime pods, TV pods, several others. Now the center line was actually still wet plumbed for a tank, but it was basically never used for it. It could even carry the 23mm cannon pack, but essentially was never used for it. No, it was basically reserved for the surveillance equipment, the camera equipment. But since the 21 had limited range, especially this early on, they added new hardpoints. For the first time, we have 2 under each wing, a total of 4. And the outer ones were plumbed for tanks, giving it quite a bit more fuel. Plus it had more tankage inside because of the bigger spine. Now, it could still carry, and often did carry, 2 missiles on the inner pylons for defense. It could also carry rockets or bombs. Theoretically, it could even carry 4 missiles. But typically, because the center line wasn't going to be fuel, that would be. So yeah, this was developed in 1964, put into production in 65, and was produced through the early 70s for the VVS. They would also make a slightly altered version known as the MiG-21R F for export to Soviet allies. Now the problems with this, because of all the extra stuff, it was quite a bit heavier. But it was a reconnaissance aircraft, so yeah, the fact that it could at least defend itself and had a lot of the still good properties of a fighter is a good thing. Continued to use the uprated engines and newer tech. And like I said, it started off this generation, but it would be far from the last, of course. By the way, this is another one that's a pride in my collection, and the reconnaissance variant here does not have a gun pack built in, one way or the other, so typically these do not have guns. Just the two K5 or K13 missiles for defense, or R5 or R13, if you prefer that. By the way, the P earlier used on all this series, the P stood for Interceptor. I'll let you guess what F stood for. But this was only the beginning. So with that, let's move on. The VBS was obviously quite happy with the 21R, even though it had it was a heavier aircraft, so not quite as nice performance as the earlier F-13, but still, it was a reconnaissance aircraft. Now, its prototype was known as the YE-7, and they would revisit it, modifying it into the YE-7S to come up with the next version. Now, this is not it here, but the next one, and it was only ever used by Russia, was the 21S, S standing for Sapphire, the latest radar, and it was basically a fighter version of the 21R. The 21R was known as the FISHBED H. The 21S was known as the FISHBED J, and had pretty much all the same features. It would carry, if it had a gun, it would be on a centerline pod. It had the outer hard points plumbed for fuel tanks, carried missiles. It had the spine for increased fuel. You know, the usual deal in the latest radar. And it was only used by Russia, like I said, and it was only produced for about 3 years, up until 1968. And as they were wrapping up 21S production for Russia, they would introduce the 21M. And this was an export model, and it was a little bit downgraded, namely in the radar and some weapons guidance systems. But the 21M did have one good feature. It had a new gun pack that was integrated into the fuselage. It was a 23 millimeter, another one of those teeter-totter type cannons with 200 rounds. And since it was integrated into the fuselage, there were two benefits. One, it reduced drag, which was good because they were noticing with the 21S, even though it had additional fuel, because of balance issues, they really didn't have much greater range. More importantly, it had a slower climb and a slightly lower max ceiling. So this gun pod returned the gun, and not at a great performance cost. More importantly, it also allowed them to start carrying a fuel tank on the center line point again. And so we can have actually up to 3 fuel tanks with the 21M and still have our gun. So obviously Russia needs something like this for its own Air Force, and that's where this model comes in here. This is the 21MF, still known as the FISHBED J, and this is from East German Air Force, but East Germany was very important, so they tended to have better technology than some other places, especially like the Middle East. Anyway, backing up, around 1969, Russia would introduce the 21SM, and this was basically a 21S, but with the 21M's integrated gun pack, and it had an improved R13 engine, replacing the older R11. And what was good for them, it was pretty much a direct drop into the fuselage. Still had the spine and all the other characteristics. And they would make an export version, this one here, the 21MF, And unlike the 21M, it did not have a downgraded Sapphire radar. And it actually had an expanded weapons compatibility. And it had the integrated gun, and it could carry up to 3 fuel tanks. Plus we had the tankage and this enlarged spine back here. But unfortunately, we're still seeing a downgrade in performance from earlier fighter models. And the range, endurance, is not improving exponentially. You know, more fuel equals more weight, and it just kind of stops being effective. Now, East Germany first got its MiG-21s in late 1962, starting off with the F-13, and then getting some 21Ms and then 21MFs here. They would operate quite a few. In fact, over 250 were still in inventory when East and West joined in 1991, and some of these were even flown in Germany's Luftwaffe throughout the 1990s until they could be replaced. Again, Russia was willing to give some of the more advanced technology to Germany because of its importance in the Warsaw Pact. This is a neat model. Again, we have the integrated cannon for the first time. I have it with some rocket pods on the wings just for fun. Centerline tank. Note the spine here, how it still tapers in the back like the 21R. And these will continue to have improved avionics and just other updates. And by this point, they're starting to build these with lessons learned from Vietnam. And progress would continue. Moving on, as we get into the very early 70s, meet the SMT, the FISHBED K. This is essentially nothing more than an SM, but it has this, what they call swollen spine in the back. While it would make a little bit more room for avionics, it was used for fuel. So it didn't give it more fuel, but of course more weight. But the trade-off was rear visibility was really reduced, and performance continued to suffer. In fact, pilots very quickly made it known that they did not like flying these at all. The SMT was only used by the Russian Air Force, and only for a few years, and actually many of those that stayed in service would be later retrofitted. We'll talk about that in a bit. I have this one set up in kind of a short-range air defense with all 4 K-13 missiles. This would have the R-13 engine, Sapphire radar, and it does have the integrated gun pack here. You can see, hopefully. I really like this model too. You don't see too many of the SMTs, and has a big hump, and it was full of fuel. It could carry a lot, but they were running into trim troubles. An issue that had really plagued the MiG for a long time, as it would drink fuel. Imbalances, especially during certain maneuvers, could lead to unfortunate consequences, including the engine cutting out. So the SMT was very short-lived and quite unpopular. Actually, in fact, so unpopular that the version designed for export, known as the 21MT, still called FISHBED K, was never really released. Here's a model of it. I have this one kind of in a clean configuration. They would only build 15 21 MTs, and they would never actually leave Russia. They would actually just stay in Russia for flight testing, demonstrations, training, that kind of thing. So yeah, only 15 of the 21 MTs. No real difference that I can discern from the SMT. And yeah, like I said, I'll leave this one kind of in a bare bones configuration. So it's only armed with its guns. And these were only built in 1971. By this time, they realized the adding bigger, chunkier parts and more fuel is just diminishing returns. Performance is actually really starting to suffer. Weapons carriage is a little better. We're starting to have improved radar. The early planes could really not do much with their radar outside of 5 or 6 miles. Later ones got out to 10 miles, and some of the final ones could actually sometimes use their radars up to about 15 to 20 miles. But again, they were meant to be controlled from the ground and short range. The early 21Fs, 21Ps and such only had like 45 minutes of flight. And later ones, yeah, it was bumped up some, but only about 90 minutes. These were always short endurance aircraft. But this was a dead end. But luckily, not for the whole series, just for the swollen tank take. So let's move in to our next and our final generation. Generation 3 started in 1972 with the introduction of the MiG-21 BIS, meaning plus or encore. And this is really the ultimate version of this fighter. It was constructed with lessons learned from Vietnam, who started using the 21 in 1966, various conflicts in the Middle East. And this model here is actually in Finnish colors, because Finland became the first non-Warsaw Pact nation to purchase the MiG-21. They first bought the 21 F-13 in 1962, and then they started using the BIS in the 1970s. India would also be another major user, in fact the largest user outside of Russia. Of course, China would make an unlicensed clone as the J7 or F7. And yeah, over 60 nations have flown at least some version of the MiG-21. But yeah, the 21 BIS may not look a lot different as a model here, because a lot of the changes are internal. For one, they got away from that swollen spine. They kind of went to the intermediate. They kind of tapered the hourglass one like we saw in the 21R. It still had the centerline tank plus the 2 wing tanks, so still a decent amount of fuel. But more importantly, they reworked the airframe. They went to newer, lighter, and stronger alloys. They also went to a new R25 engine, which was more fuel efficient and delivered more thrust. And they had a new afterburner system introduced here. It had new avionics, compatibility with new weapons. It still carried the K-13, but it would start to be sent out with the new R-60 missile. It could carry up to 6 of them. It also still could carry unguided rockets and bombs. Had the internal 23mm cannon. Had an improved radar system. It had look-down capability, not look-down, shoot-down. That would have to come with the next MiG. But at least it had look-down capability. So in most every way, it was just an improved model. And it would continue in service. You'd think it'd be replaced in Russia by the MiG-23, but in actuality, it would continue on until the MiG-29. The first 3 years of production at Gorky would be for the VVS. Then they would start exporting these in large numbers for about a decade. And finally, MiG-21 production would end in Russia in 1985. And over 10,600 would be built there. And then they would be built in India, over 650 there. And nearly 200 in Czechoslovakia. And frankly, an unknown number in China, although there are estimations. But since the J7 isn't, strictly speaking, a one-to-one MiG-21 clone, we'll leave it alone. That means over 11,400, getting quite close to 11,500 of these were built. That's a huge number for a military aircraft. Oh, another thing about the biz, they reworked the maintenance. They were easier to keep running, repair. Just a more user-friendly aircraft, and that's why so many nations have flown these, upgraded them. In fact, India still has over 100 in its military. Russia would fly the 21 into the 1990s, finally replacing it with the newer MiGs and Sukhois. China still flies their version. Yeah, a lot of them do. Because it works. Simple and dependable. This one kind of split the difference. The Biz still didn't have quite the sports car handling of the early 21F. But it wasn't a pig like the SMT, MTs. It had reasonably good speed. About Mach 1.7. A little faster. It could still go supersonic even at sea level. Had a maximum altitude of between 57 and 58,000 feet. Could carry nearly 4,500 pounds in ordnance on a total of 5 hardpoints. Again, 3 of them being plumbed. And yeah, still quite small aircraft. It's under 50 feet long and has a wingspan of just 23.5 feet. And it's terribly inexpensive to produce, especially by Western standards. This is very analogous to the F5. Just a simple, dependable, upgradable, customizable aircraft. And as I said at the beginning of the video, there were also several 2-seat trainer versions, but I don't have models of those, so can't really get into it right now. This was actually my first MiG-21 model. And even though it came after Vietnam, it's probably the most iconic because it is the most product improved one. It's worth pointing out this is also where the VVS and PVO kind of met back up. Instead of having separate models, they both flew the Biz. Although the electronics and avionics could be slightly different. For example, the VVS version, at least some of them, could carry a nuclear weapon, whereas the PVOs were still optimized for air defense. It's also worth pointing out early production Bizes were known as the FISHBED L, and later production ones from the last decade or so are known as the FISHBED N. And the only real difference is a few antenna, different avionics, maybe different cockpit controls and weapons. But really, externally, they look 99% the same. And so the FISHBED N would be the last, at least major NATO-named version. But there are plenty of post-Soviet era reworks done in all kinds of nations, including Israel, who rebuilds these for some people. So yeah, there we have this very cool Soviet fighter. With that, let's wrap things up. Before we wrap up, I have one more MiG-21 Biz to show you. This is from the Croatian Air Force. They had a few inherited from the former Yugoslavia and used during the Civil War there. This one is fitted out in an air-to-air configuration with the R-60 missiles. These are small and lightweight, and if you wanted to have them on the double rack, they had to go on the outboard pylon, meaning no external tanks there, although you could still put one on the center line. And as for the inner pylon, well, we're still kind of stuck with our original R3 K-13 type missile. Even though it's not as effective, well, a lot of air forces had tons of these, so why not fly them? And they would still try to have a mix of heat and radar guided to kind of mix things up a bit. So a total of 6 missiles on this, which is about the max missile payload that a MiG-21 could really have. You wouldn't really see this mixture with air-to-surface rockets or anything. It was either air-to-surface exclusively or air-to-air. And just thought I would show you this. Another biz. I think it's neat. It goes to show you how that they kept upgrading these, and some were even upgraded to take NATO standard armament like Sidewinders. Others were upgraded to take French armament like the Magic missile. So yeah, MiG-21, very flexible little plane. Well, I really appreciate you hanging out with me. I enjoy talking about MiGs. From the 15 and the 17, kind of their flying cigar shape, to the 21 here, which definitely has its own shape going on. I wish someone would do a MiG-19 in 1/72 scale diecast. I'd even take plastic, like from Easy Model, but no one does. I also do wish the Hobby Master would do one of the 2-seaters, the U or the UB or the US version. But oh well, take what we can get, right? But it's just an interesting series all in all, and Hobby Master really does do a good job with all the options and being pretty much all die-cast metal. The only complaint, I do wish they would come with alternative armaments. A couple of these did come with 2 payloads, but some, like the Recce version here, just had the single setup. But oh well, it is what it is, folks. But I'm happy with them, and since I was kind of getting the variants straight in my own head, I thought, heck, it'd be fun to talk about them with you. So let me know what you think. Also, hopefully I was able to get something on camera. It is what it is, guys. It's just difficult. But I appreciate you hanging out with me, and I wish you all the best. If you could, please like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.